Good morning. This is Ron, and it is Wednesday, April the 4th. Welcome to Story Time. And today is a Storytime Extra, and I'll be reading part one of an article from Imprimis magazine it's an article entitled How to Meet the Strategic Challenge Posed by China by David P. Goldman. China poses a formidable strategic challenge to America, but we should keep in mind that it is in large part motivated by insecurity and fear. America has inherent strengths that China does not, and the greatest danger to America is not a lack of strength, but complacency. China is a phenomenon unlike anything in economic history. The average Chinese consumes 17 times more today than in 1987. This is like the difference between driving a car and riding a bicycle, or between indoor plumbing and an outhouse. In an incredibly short period of time, this formerly backward country has lifted itself into the very first rank of world economies. Over the same period, China has moved approximately 600 million people from the countryside to the cities, the equivalent of moving the entire population of Europe from the Ural Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. To accommodate those people, it built the equivalent of a new London, plus a new Berlin, Rome, Glasgow, Helsinki, Naples, and Lyons. And of course, moving people whose ancestors spent millennia in the monotony of traditional village life and bringing them into the industrial world led to an explosion of productivity. Where does America stand in respect to China? By a measure economists call purchasing power parity, you can buy a lot more with $100 in China than you can in the United States. Adjusted for that measure, the Chinese economy is already bigger than ours. In terms of dollars, our economy is still bigger, but the Chinese are gaining on us. And in the next 8 to 10 years, their economy, unlike the economies of our previous competitors, will catch up. China, on the other hand, is an empire based on the coercion of unwilling people. Whereas the United States became a great nation populated by people who chose to be part of it, China conquered peoples of different ethnicities and with different languages and has kept them together by force. Whereas our principle is e pluribus unum, the Chinese reality is e pluribus pluribus, with a dictator at the top. China once covered a relatively small geographic area. It took about 1,500 years for it to reach its current borders in the 9th century. These borders are natural frontiers. China can't expand over the Himalayas to India, while its extreme west is desert, and to its east is the ocean. So China is not an inherently expansionist power. Nor is China unified. It has a written system of several thousand characters that takes 7 years of elementary education to learn, working 4 hours a day with an ink brush, ink pot, and paper. Learning these characters well enough to read a school textbook or a newspaper is how the Chinese are socialized. The current generation is the first where the majority of Chinese understand the common language, due to the centralization of the state and the mass media. But the Chinese still speak very different languages. Cantonese and Mandarin are as different as Finnish and French. In Hong Kong, you'll see two Chinese screaming at each other in broken English because one speaks Mandarin and the other speaks Cantonese, and they don't have a word in common. China is inherently unstable because all that holds it together is an imperial culture and the tax collector in Beijing. It is like a collection of very powerful, oppositely charged magnets held together by superglue. It looks stable, but it isn't. Within the living memory of older Chinese, China underwent an era of national division, warlordism, civil war, starvation, and degradation. The century of humiliation, as the Chinese call it, which began with the Opium Wars in 1848 and ended with the success of the Communist Revolution in 1949, was a century in which civil war claimed untold millions of lives, and the terror of a return to those conditions is a specter that haunts the Chinese leadership. China, like Russia, responds to its past humiliation by challenging American power. It would be naive to expect the Chinese or the Russians to be our friends. The best we can hope for is peaceful competition and occasional cooperation in matters of mutual concern. But it is also important to recognize that American policy errors exacerbate their suspicion and distrust. For example, our decision to impose majority rule in Iraq created a Shiite sectarian state now allied to Iran, and it left Iraq's Sunni minority without a state to protect them. This drove the Sunnis into the hands of non-state actors and unintentionally helped al-Qaeda and ISIS. Sunni jihad is a serious security threat to Russia and China, and Russia's intervention in Syria is, in part, a response to our mistakes. The Chinese live a double life. If you walk down the street in Beijing, you see people who dress very drably, who show little emotion, and do their best not to draw attention to themselves. But if you go to a Chinese wedding or a restaurant where families gather, the same people are loud and bumptious. Their real existence is a family existence. During the Lunar New Year, the Chinese have the largest migration in history. 3 billion long-distance journeys are undertaken because all Chinese will travel long distances to be with their family. Here in the West, we have a concept of rights and privileges that traces back to the Roman Republic. We serve in the army, we pay taxes, and the state has certain obligations in return. There is no such concept in China. Beijing rules by whim. The Chinese do whatever the emperor, or today the Communist Party, asks, hoping they will be rewarded, but there's no sense of anything deserved. The idea of the state held together by a common interest, as in Cicero, or by a common love, as in St. Augustine, is unknown in China. The imperial power is looked on as a necessary evil. The Chinese had an emperor for 3,000 years, and when they didn't have an emperor, they killed one another. It's all very well to lecture the Chinese about the benefits of Western democracy, but most Chinese believe they need the equivalent of an emperor to prevent a reprise of the century of humiliation. From the standpoint of most Chinese, the Communist Party dynasty that took charge in 1949 has brought about a golden age. It's the first time in Chinese history when no one is afraid of starving to death or of a warlord coming through and raping the women and burning the crops. So for the time being, the regime has a great deal of support, even though it is more comprehensively totalitarian than Hitler or Stalin could have imagined. As deplorable as the regime looks to us, the prospects for transforming China's way of governance are, for now, negligible. China's Communist Party government is a merciless meritocracy, which is one reason that Chinese have difficulty understanding American politics. If you're in the Chinese leadership, you made it there by scoring high on a long series of exams, starting at age 12, which means you haven't met a stupid person since you were in junior high school. The fact that democracies can frequently advance stupid people, we are entitled to do that if we wish, doesn't make sense to the Chinese. The one thing President Xi Jinping cannot do is get his child into Peking University unless that child scores high on his exams. Here in America, you can buy your way into Harvard. You can't do that in China. So while the Chinese Communist Party is not a particularly efficient organization and is certainly not a moral one, it has a lot of incredibly smart people in it. Along with ensuring internal stability at all costs, Chinese leaders are determined to make China impregnable from the outside. We hardly hear the term South China Sea these days because that sea has become a Chinese lake. It has become a Chinese lake because the Chinese have made it clear they will go to war over it. There's a Chinese proverb, kill the chicken for the instruction of the monkey. China has an even greater concern over Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party is terrified that a rebel province like Taiwan can set in motion centrifugal forces that the party will be unable to control. So the adhesion of Taiwan to the Chinese state, the imperial center, is for the Chinese government an existential matter. They will go to war over it. By demonstrating their willingness to fight over the South China Sea, they are demonstrating that they will fight all the more viciously over Taiwan. Turning back to our two economies, consider the three graphs above. China does something that Japan, Korea, and other Asian nations do. It massively subsidized capital investment in heavy industry. And that is the end of part one of Imprimis, and it is the March 2018 issue, volume 47, number 3, and the article is called How to Meet the Strategic Challenge Posed by China by David P. Goldman, who's a columnist for the Asia Times. He also writes regularly for PJ Media and the Claremont Review of Books, and is the classical music critic for Tablet Magazine. He's directed research at investment banks and served as a consultant for the National Security Council and the Department of Defense. A senior fellow of the London Institute for Policy Studies, he is the author of How Civilizations Die and Why Islam is Dying Too. In 2017, he was a Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Fellow in Journalism at Hillsdale College. And I will be doing part 2 of this on Friday, the 6th. Tomorrow I will be returning to Ayn Rand's book called Philosophy Who Needs It. I apologize for the kind of scratchy tone of my voice, but I'm getting over a cold, and so I imagine things will be getting better as the days progress. But until tomorrow, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.